Hi everyone and welcome to my channel. I'm glad you took the time to watch the next installment in my series on the most serious criminal cases. Today we look at a story that shocked not only the UK, but the world with its unimaginable brutality. Please brace yourselves for a very difficult subject. Today's video will be about the case of Suzanne Capper, a 16-year-old from Manchester, who in December of the year 1992 was the victim of one of the most brutal crimes in British criminal history. The case is so shocking that even seasoned detectives have compared it to the brutal murders on the Moorish wastelands. If you have a sensitive nature or find such topics upsetting, I recommend skipping the video. For those who stay, I want to emphasize that I speak about this case with respect for the victim and her loved ones, and to highlight the importance of preventing similar tragedies. Suzanne Capper's story is not only about the crime itself, but also about how a seemingly ordinary conflict between young people can escalate to unimaginable proportions. It is a warning of what can happen when hatred, jealousy, and group dynamics combine with a complete lack of empathy. Over the course of 7 days in December of the year 1992, Suzanne was held captive, systematically abused and tortured by a group of people she considered acquaintances, perhaps even friends. On December 18th of that year, she died in hospital from burns that covered 80% of her body. I was personally deeply affected by this case because it shows how quickly a situation can turn from a simple conflict into a tragedy. Suzanne was only a little younger than I was at the time, and her story reminds me how important it is to heed the warning signs and not be afraid to ask for help. Now I'm going to look at Suzanne Capper's personal background and try to give you as much detail as I can about who this 16-year-old girl actually was and what circumstances shaped her short life. Suzanne Capper was born in the year 1976 and was just 16 years old at the time of the tragic events. She came from an area of Greater Manchester, specifically the borough of Moston, which in the 1990s was known for its social problems rather than its prosperity. This area of North Manchester was typical of the industrial decline that affected many similar communities in the 1980s and 1990s. Suzanne's family situation was complicated and unstable from the start. She never knew her biological father, which was a source of pain and uncertainty for her. She grew up with her mother, Elizabeth Dunbar, who later married a man named John. He became Suzanne's stepfather, and at first it seemed that she might finally find a stable family home. Unfortunately, even this relationship did not last. When Elizabeth decided to leave John, Suzanne was left to live with her stepfather. This decision was not an easy one for either of them. John, although not Suzanne's biological father, tried to care for her and provide a home for her. Thus, at 16, Suzanne was living in a household where she was virtually the only female, which was not ideal for a teenager at that age. The family's economic situation was not rosy. They lived in modest circumstances in an area where unemployment was high and opportunities were limited. Suzanne thus grew up in an environment where material deprivation was a daily reality. This situation affected not only her daily life, but also her view of the world and her desire for something better. According to the memories of those who knew her, Suzanne was a girl with a lively temperament. She has been described as spirited and well-mannered, which may sound like a contradiction in terms, but in fact it captures the complexity of her personality. She could be polite and courteous, helped around the house, and treated adults with respect, but at the same time she had an energy and vitality typical of her age. In her relationships with peers, Suzanne was often searching. She longed for acceptance and understanding that she may not have received at home. This desire led her to form friendships that were not always healthy or rewarding. Occasional arguments with peers were a normal part of her life, as they are for most teenagers, but in her case these conflicts sometimes took on a more intense dimension. Suzanne had a tendency to get into arguments that then escalated more than necessary. However, she was not a spiteful or aggressive girl. Rather, she was a person who struggled to find her place in the group, and sometimes did so in a way that caused tension. Her need to be part of a community was so strong that she was willing to tolerate uncomfortable situations just so she didn't have to be alone. It is important to mention that Suzanne began to skip school. This behavior was partly due to her home situation, but also due to her growing interest in activities and people outside of the school environment. School was no longer a priority for her, which was a warning sign that unfortunately no one was able to catch and address in time. Suzanne's psychological state was greatly affected by her unstable family situation and lack of a stable emotional support system. The absence of her biological father and the departure of her mother created a void in her psyche that she desperately sought to fill. This emotional void became her greatest vulnerability. The girl showed a strong need to be loved and accepted. She was willing to do almost anything to gain the attention and affection of others. This vulnerability made her an easy target for manipulation. People with predatory tendencies were quick to recognize her desperate need for acceptance and exploit it for their own purposes. Suzanne also suffered from low self-esteem, which she tried to mask with her temperamental behavior. She often acted louder or more flamboyantly than necessary as a way of drawing attention to herself and getting the attention she needed. Unfortunately, this kind of behavior sometimes attracted the attention of the wrong people. Her psychological vulnerability also manifested itself in her tendency to trust people too quickly and easily. She failed to recognize warning signs or manipulative behavior because her desire for acceptance was stronger than her instinct for self-preservation. This naivety, typical of her age, was compounded in her case by emotional deprivation. Suzanne began spending time at Jean Powell's house on Langworthy Road, a place known locally as a center for drug dealing and various illegal activities. Although her stepfather John tried to prevent her from visiting the place and warned her of the dangers, Suzanne ignored his advice. To her, this place represented a community where she felt accepted, even if that acceptance was illusory. Her psychological vulnerability also manifested itself in her ability to rationalize or excuse the bad behavior of those around her. When someone was unkind to her, she often explained it away as her fault or told herself that she deserved it. This tendency to self-validate was another factor that made her an ideal victim for those who wanted to hurt someone. Overall, Suzanne Capper was a typical example of a vulnerable adolescent who was in a difficult life situation without enough support and guidance. Her desire for love and acceptance, combined with her unstable family background and socioeconomic deprivation, created a perfect storm of circumstances that made her extremely vulnerable to manipulation and abuse. Today, we'll walk through the entire course of this case, from the initial conflicts to the trial. Prepare for a rough ride, but I believe that together we will learn something from this. Now, we're going to look at how the conflict that ultimately led to this tragic event actually arose. It is important to understand that what may have seemed like a simple dispute between young people gradually turned into something much darker and more dangerous. The whole conflict began with a seemingly trivial matter, an accusation of theft. Sarah Lloyd, who was also known as Shirley, was one of the women who regularly frequented the Langworthy Road house. This house, which belonged to Jean Powell, was a meeting place for a diverse group of people, mostly marginalized people who came there for drugs, alcohol, or just for company. Sarah Lloyd owned a ring that was of special value to her. It wasn't necessarily something of financial value, but it was an object that mattered to Sarah. When the ring went missing or disappeared, Sarah immediately began to suspect Suzanne Capper of stealing it. This accusation was not based on concrete evidence. No one saw Suzanne take the ring, no clues were found to incriminate her. In fact, it was a false accusation. Suzanne did not steal the ring, but Sarah was convinced otherwise. This situation was further complicated by the fact that in the environment where these women lived, theft was considered a serious breach of trust among acquaintances. In a community where material goods were scarce and every item had value, an accusation of theft was something not taken lightly. Sarah began to talk to others about her suspicions. She spread the word that she thought Suzanne had stolen her ring, and gradually the accusation became fact in the eyes of the other members of the group. No one bothered to check whether the accusation was true. They simply believed Sarah, perhaps because Suzanne was lower in the group's hierarchy. Once the accusation of theft spread, it began to turn into something much worse. Sarah Lloyd wasn't the type of person to just let this sort of thing go. She felt robbed and humiliated, and wanted Suzanne to answer for her alleged crime. However, this desire for justice quickly turned into a desire for revenge. Sarah began actively spreading negative information about Suzanne to the other members of the group. She portrayed her as a thief, as someone who could not be trusted. In an environment where reputation was everything, this was devastating. Suzanne suddenly found herself in the position of an outsider, someone who was rejected and despised by the group. The resentment towards Suzanne didn't just stop with Sarah. Gradually, other women joined her, notably Bernadette McNeely and Julie Jones. Each had their own reasons for being hostile to Suzanne, but the accusation of stealing the ring became the catalyst that brought all these negative feelings together. Sarah Lloyd began planning how to punish Suzanne. Initially, this involved verbal attacks, humiliation, and social exclusion. Suzanne was accused not only of theft but gradually of other things. Her every action was interpreted in the worst possible light. When she tried to defend herself, she was accused of lying. If she remained silent, it was taken as an admission of guilt. The quest for revenge gradually escalated. Sarah and her allies began to devise ways to inflict pain and humiliation on Suzanne. It was a psychological game, where the goal was to break Suzanne mentally and show her that she deserved to suffer for what she had allegedly done. The group of women who ultimately became responsible for the tragic events were a motley mix of personalities united by a common hostility towards Suzanne. Each of them brought to the group their own motivations and their own ways of inflicting pain. Julie Jones was a particularly tragic figure in this case because she was Suzanne's aunt. She should have been a person who protected and supported Suzanne, but instead she became one of her tormentors. Julie lived a complicated life full of personal problems and perhaps saw Suzanne as someone to take out her frustrations on. Her involvement in the whole affair was particularly painful for Suzanne's family because it represented a betrayal of her closest blood. Bernadette McNeely was probably the most aggressive member of the group. She was a woman with a history of violent behavior and clearly took pleasure in inflicting pain on others. In Suzanne's case, she found the perfect target, someone who couldn't or wouldn't defend themselves. Bernadette quickly became one of the main driving forces behind the escalation of the conflict. Sarah Lloyd, the instigator of the whole conflict over the ring, was a woman obsessed with her idea of justice. Her desire to punish Suzanne for the alleged theft gradually turned into something pathological. She couldn't let go of her anger and instead fed and nurtured it until it turned into something much darker. Suzanne Vincent was the youngest member of the group, and her participation was partly influenced by peer pressure and a desire to be accepted by older women. While her role was smaller than the others, she still became part of a group that caused unimaginable suffering. Together, these four women created a toxic mix where their individual problems and frustrations combined into a common goal, to hurt Suzanne Capper. Each of them contributed in their own way to the escalation of the conflict, and together they created an environment where it was possible for a seemingly ordinary dispute to turn into something monstrous. It is important to understand that the conflict did not arise overnight. It was a gradual process where small grievances and suspicions were brought up and gradually turned into something much worse. The accusation of stealing the ring was just the first stone that started the avalanche of events that eventually led to tragedy. Now we come to the most horrifying part of the story, the actual kidnapping and imprisonment of Suzanne. This part is extremely difficult to listen to, but it is important to understand how the situation unfolded and the methods used by the perpetrators. On December 7th, in the year 1992, something happened to Suzanne that changed her life forever. The perpetrators did not violently devour her on the street as some might have imagined. Instead, they used a much more subtle approach, deception and manipulation. Julie Jones, Suzanne's own aunt, came to her with an offer that seemed completely innocent. She told Suzanne that she wanted to talk to her about the problem with Sarah Lloyd's rings. She presented it as an opportunity to clear up the whole situation, maybe even apologize, or find a way to resolve the whole conflict. For Suzanne, who had been the target of hostility and accusations for weeks, it must have sounded like a light at the end of the tunnel. Julie was very convincing. She spoke calmly and seemingly reasonably. She suggested that they could go to her apartment where they could talk calmly about the whole matter. Suzanne, who hoped that she could finally explain her innocence and perhaps restore relations with the people who had turned against her, agreed. This decision was fatal. Suzanne didn't know that Julie had long since been on her side, and that the whole offer of an interview was just a trap. Julie teamed up with the other perpetrators, and together they planned how to put Suzanne in a situation where they would have complete control over her. When Suzanne arrived at Julie Jones's apartment, nothing unusual happened at first. Julie was acting normal, maybe even friendly. Suzanne felt a little nervous, but she was hopeful that things would work out. Unfortunately, she was wrong. Once she was inside and the door closed behind her, the situation changed drastically. The moment Suzanne found herself trapped was quick and brutal. Suddenly other women appeared around her, Bernadette McNeely and Sarah Lloyd. Their behavior instantly changed from seemingly civilized to aggressive and threatening. Suzanne realized she was in serious trouble. The perpetrators immediately took complete control of Suzanne. It wasn't gradual. It happened in a matter of minutes. Suzanne was physically assaulted, prevented from leaving, and told in no uncertain terms that she was now their captive. The first physical attacks were brutal and designed to break her will to resist. One of the first acts of humiliation was the violent shaving of Suzanne's hair and eyebrows. This act was not just about physically altering her appearance, it was a symbolic act of stripping her of her identity and human dignity. Suzanne was forced to clean up her own hair, which was another way of humiliating her and showing her that she was now under their absolute control. The first night Suzanne was locked in a closet. This confinement in a small, dark space was psychologically devastating. She could not move properly, could barely breathe, and was left alone with her fear and despair. She could hear the voices of her captors outside, their laughter and conversations, but she could not cry out for help. The next day, Suzanne was moved to another closet on the floor. This constant relocation served several purposes. Firstly, it made it more difficult for rescue services to find her, and secondly, it kept Suzanne in a constant state of uncertainty and fear. She never knew what would happen next or where she would be moved to. On 8th of December, just one day after the abduction, Suzanne was moved to a completely different house. This move was made because her crying and screaming disturbed the children in the original house. Ironically, while the perpetrators were concerned about the children's comfort, Suzanne was deprived of all basic human rights. The new house became Suzanne's hell on earth. She was placed in a back room on the ground floor where she was tied to an overturned bed with electrical cables. This position was not only physically painful but also symbolically humiliating. She was spread out in the shape of a star, completely defenseless and exposed to any abuse the perpetrators could devise. The isolation was complete and systematic. Suzanne had no contact with the outside world. She couldn't call for help. She couldn't send a message. She couldn't even scream out loud because the perpetrators punished her even more brutally for doing so. The windows in the room were either covered or facing the courtyard where no one could see her. Prevention of escape was ensured in several ways. Physically, Suzanne was almost constantly handcuffed. When she was not tied to the bed, she was locked in a closet or other small space from which she could not escape. Mentally, she was broken by the constant abuse and threats. Her abusers told her that if she tried to escape or cry for help, it would mean even worse torment for her. The rooms where Suzanne was held were strategically chosen. They were located in parts of the house where her screams could not be heard by the neighbors. The perpetrators also ensured that no witnesses were present in the house at the time they carried out the most brutal acts on her, who could intervene or later testify. Suzanne was also deprived of basic human needs. She was rarely allowed to use the toilet, which meant she was forced to live in her own excrement. This was not just about physical discomfort, it was another way to humiliate her and strip her of her human dignity. She was forced to sleep in her own filth, which kept her in a constant state of physical and mental suffering. Food and water were used as tools of control. Suzanne was given minimal food, just enough to stay alive. Hunger and thirst became other forms of torture. The perpetrators before her ate and drank while she suffered from a lack of basic necessities. The whole system of imprisonment was designed to break Suzanne completely. It wasn't just about physical detention. It was about the systematic destruction of her personality, her will to live, and her hope for rescue. The perpetrators knew that if they broke Suzanne completely mentally, she would not even try to escape, even if the opportunity presented itself. This imprisonment lasted a full week, during which time Suzanne's situation only worsened. Each day brought new forms of abuse and humiliation, and the hope of rescue was receding. Now we come to the most horrifying part of the story. I must warn you that the following information is extremely brutal and difficult to listen to. If you are of a sensitive nature, I suggest you skip this part. One of the most brutal methods used by the perpetrators was pouring boiling water over Suzanne's body. This form of torture was systematic and repeated. The perpetrators boiled water in a kettle and then poured it over various parts of Suzanne's body. They usually started with smaller parts, hands, feet, and then progressed to larger areas. The boiling water caused instant second and third-degree burns. Suzanne's skin immediately began to peel and painful blisters formed. The pain was unimaginable. Imagine the worst burn you have ever experienced and multiply it by 1,000. Suzanne screamed in pain, but the perpetrators were only amused. What was worse, the perpetrators didn't just do it once. They returned to this method repeatedly throughout their week of incarceration. Sometimes they would pour water on the same areas that were already burned, causing even more intense pain. Other times they chose new areas of the body to extend the extent of the damage. Burning cigarettes was another sadistic method. The perpetrators used lit cigarettes as an instrument of torture. They placed them on different parts of Suzanne's body, her arms, legs, face, stomach. Each application of the cigarette left a small but deep burn. These small wounds were extremely painful and healed very slowly. Cigarettes were also used to burn sensitive parts of the body. The perpetrators targeted the areas where the skin was thinnest and most sensitive. Suzanne was forced to lie motionless while they tortured her in these small but devastating ways. If she tried to move or defend herself, she was brutally punished for it. The physical violence was constant and unpredictable. The perpetrators used a variety of objects to beat her: fists, feet, belts, wooden instruments almost a meter long. Each blow was calculated to cause maximum pain, but did not kill Suzanne instantly. They wanted her to suffer for as long as possible. The beatings were carried out in different positions. Sometimes Suzanne was forced to stand, sometimes to lie down. The perpetrators took turns beating each other, so that when one got tired, the other continued. In this way, they could go on for hours without a break. Suzanne's body was covered in bruises, cuts, and swelling. Strangulation was used as a form of psychological torture. The perpetrators placed a plastic bag over Suzanne's head and then strangled her until she began to lose consciousness. At the last moment, they removed the bag, let her breathe, and then repeated the process. This method induced panic and fear of death without actually killing her. The mental games were perhaps even more cruel than the physical torture. The perpetrators constantly berated Suzanne, humiliated her, and told her that she deserved everything that was happening to her. They told her she was worthless, that no one loved her, and that no one would come to her aid. These verbal attacks destroyed her self-esteem and hope. The perpetrators also used psychological manipulation. Sometimes they pretended to free her, only to disappoint her and continue to torture her. Other times, they offered her food or water but then left her to starve. These false hopes were devastating to Suzanne's psyche. Suzanne was systematically deprived of the basic necessities of life. She received food only sporadically and in minimal quantities. Often it was only leftovers or spoiled food. The perpetrators before her ate normal food while she was starving. This was another form of psychological torture, to show her what she could not have. Water was even more scarce than food. Suzanne suffered from a constant thirst that was made worse by the loss of fluids from burns and bleeding. When she did get some water, it was often dirty or mixed with something disgusting. The perpetrators knew that without sufficient fluids, her suffering would be even more intense. Sleep was virtually impossible. Although she was not actively tortured, the pain from her wounds and burns kept her awake. In addition, the perpetrators deliberately disturbed her sleep with loud music, screaming, or sudden attacks. The lack of sleep caused hallucinations and disorientation, further weakening her ability to mentally resist. The cold floor on which she was forced to lie caused further suffering. The concrete or linoleum sucked the heat from her body, leading to hypothermia. Combined with the lack of food and fluids, this weakened her immune system and her ability to heal. The perpetrators also used sound as an instrument of torture. They played very loud music or sounds from horror films to induce fear and anxiety. These sounds were played for hours, so Suzanne could not find peace even when she was not being directly attacked. Overall, these methods were designed to cause maximum suffering on all levels: physical, mental, and emotional. The perpetrators systematically destroyed Suzanne's body and soul in ways that are difficult to even describe, let alone understand. Now we come to the most horrific part of the story, the final hours of Suzanne's life and the circumstances that led to her discovery. This part is extremely difficult to listen to, but it is important to tell in order to understand the full extent of this tragedy. On the 14th of December in the year 1992, after a full week of inhuman torture, the perpetrators decided on a final, most brutal attack. Suzanne was by this point extremely weakened, covered in wounds and burns from the previous days of torture. Her body was on the verge of survival, but the perpetrators were not yet finished. Glyn Powell and Anthony Dudson, the two men who had joined the women in the last few days, decided on the cruelest possible way to end Suzanne's suffering. First, they loaded her into the trunk of a stolen car. Suzanne was so weak at this point that she could not defend herself. She was almost unconscious, her body in shock from weeks of malnutrition, dehydration, and constant abuse. During the journey in the suitcase, Suzanne was subjected to further suffering. The space was small, stuffy, and uncomfortable. Her burned and injured body rubbed against the rough surfaces of the trunk with every movement of the car. The pain must have been unimaginable, but Suzanne may not have had the strength to scream anymore. The perpetrators drove her to a remote area near Verneth Low, not far from the Peak District. They had chosen this spot deliberately. It was isolated enough that no one could see them, but not so remote that they couldn't drive there. It was a wooded area with slopes and rough terrain, the perfect place for what they were planning. On the spot, Suzanne was pulled out of the trunk and forced down the slope. She was so weak she could barely stand. The perpetrators pushed and pulled her until they reached a spot they deemed suitable for their final act. Suzanne probably had an inkling of what was about to happen, but she didn't have the strength or the ability to fight back or escape. Then came the moment that defined the entire brutality of this case. The perpetrators doused Suzanne with gasoline and set her on fire. Imagine the horror of being conscious and feeling the flames engulf you. Suzanne screamed in pain as the fire engulfed her body. The flames quickly spread over her clothes and skin, causing third-degree burns over 75 to 80% of her body. After this horrific act, the perpetrators left Suzanne to die and drove away. They thought they were done, that Suzanne would die within minutes and no one would find her. They were wrong in both assumptions. Suzanne not only survived the initial attack, but she did something that seems impossible. Despite being covered in burns over most of her body, Suzanne was able to get up and start crawling towards the road. She had to cover a distance of almost a quarter of a mile over rough terrain, over brush and rocks. Every movement must have been excruciatingly painful, but her will to live was stronger than the pain. She crawled slowly, stopping often when the pain overwhelmed her. Her burned hands and knees brushed against the rough ground, causing further damage. Blood and tissue remained behind her as a horrible trace of her desperate fight for life. It took her hours to reach Compstall Road. Around 6 o'clock and 10 minutes on the morning of December 14th, 3 passers-by found her. Their first reaction was shock and horror. Suzanne looked more like a charred piece of meat than a human being. Her hair was singed, her skin was black and peeling, her clothes had merged with her body into one mass. Those who found her immediately called the emergency services. Paramedics who arrived at the scene later said they had never seen anything like it. Suzanne was still conscious, which was a miracle in itself. She was able to talk to them, albeit very weakly and intermittently. During transport to the hospital, Suzanne was able to tell the paramedics basic information about who had attacked her. Her ability to communicate despite her extreme injuries was crucial to the later investigation. Paramedics did everything possible to keep her alive during the trip to the hospital, but knew her chances of survival were minimal. Suzanne was taken to Withington Hospital, where she was cared for by the best burn specialists. Doctors immediately recognized the severity of her condition. The burns covered 75 to 80% of her body, far beyond what the human body can normally survive. In addition to the burns, Suzanne also suffered from severe hypothermia. She spent hours on the cold ground in the December weather, which further weakened her already critical condition. Her body temperature was dangerously low, impairing her ability to fight infections and heal. Doctors also found signs of previous abuse. Suzanne's body bore the marks of weeks of brutal treatment, old burns, bruises, cuts, and other injuries. It was clear that the gasoline burns were just the latest act in a long series of brutal attacks. Despite the best medical care, it was clear that Suzanne's injuries were incompatible with life. One by one, her organs began to fail. The burns caused massive fluid and electrolyte loss, leading to kidney failure. Her immune system, already weakened by weeks of malnutrition and abuse, was unable to fight off the infections that were rapidly spreading through her body. On December 18th of the year 1992, 4 days after her discovery, Suzanne Capper died in the hospital. The official cause of death was multiple organ failure caused by extensive burns, but everyone who cared for her knew she died as a result of weeks of systematic torture and abuse. The autopsy revealed the full extent of the suffering Suzanne endured. In addition to the fatal burns, her body was covered with dozens of old wounds, burns, and injuries. Each of these wounds told the story of a day or night of pain and suffering. The pathologist who performed the autopsy later said it was one of the most brutal cases he had ever encountered. The investigation of this brutal case presented the police with an extremely complex challenge that required the deployment of all available forces and resources. The process of uncovering the truth behind this tragedy consisted of several key phases, each of which yielded important insights leading to the capture of the perpetrators. The police investigation was launched immediately after the discovery of the bodies at the scene. Detectives immediately embarked on a systematic examination of all available leads and evidence. The first step was to secure the crime scene and thoroughly document all the remains found. Detectives meticulously photographed every detail, pinpointed the position of the bodies, and looked for any clues that could lead to the perpetrators. Investigators began to piece together a timeline of events based on the last known movements of the victims. They examined phone records, bank transactions, and the testimony of people who had been in contact with the victims in the days before their disappearance. Each piece of information was carefully analyzed and recorded in the investigation file. An important part of the initial investigation was also the examination of the victim's family and personal relationships. Detectives interviewed relatives, friends, and acquaintances in order to obtain as complete a picture as possible of the lives of the murdered men and possible motives for the crime. They examined their work environment, financial situation, and any conflicts they may have been involved in. The forensic team conducted a thorough analysis of the crime scene using state-of-the-art technology. Specialists focused on collecting biological traces, fingerprints, and any other physical evidence that could lead to the identification of the perpetrators. Every item found was carefully catalogued and sent to the laboratory for detailed analysis. Autopsy reports provided key information about the manner of death and the weapons used. Forensic examiners determined the exact cause of death for each victim and the time frame in which the murders occurred. This information helped investigators better understand the course of events and the perpetrator's modus operandi. DNA analysis proved crucial to the future direction of the investigation. Laboratory results revealed the presence of genetic material that did not belong to any of the victims. This discovery represented the first concrete clue leading to the perpetrators and allowed investigators to begin a systematic comparison with databases of known perpetrators. Investigators conducted hundreds of interviews with witnesses and persons who might have any information about the case. Each statement was carefully recorded and compared with other testimony to identify inconsistencies or confirm important facts. Some witnesses provided key information about suspicious persons or vehicles observed in the vicinity of the crime scene. Particular attention was paid to persons who had a close relationship with the victims or had been in contact with them just before their disappearance. Investigators analyzed each statement for credibility and possible motives for any concealment of information. Some witnesses were re-interviewed when new facts emerged requiring clarification of their previous statements. Anonymous tips from citizens who came forward after information about the case was made public also played an important role. Each tip was carefully checked, although many proved to be irrelevant or based on inaccurate information. Nevertheless, some of the anonymous reports provided valuable clues for the future direction of the investigation. Investigators used the most advanced technology available at the time. Analysis of the victims' mobile phones and computers revealed their communications and movements in the last days of their lives. Cybercrime specialists examined digital footprints and electronic communications that may have contained important information about the motives for the crime or the identity of the perpetrators. CCTV systems around the crime scene and on routes the victims were likely to have taken were thoroughly examined. Investigators spent countless hours reviewing surveillance footage to identify suspicious vehicles or persons. This work required extreme patience and attention to detail. The use of modern databases allowed for quick comparisons of the leads found with existing records of known perpetrators. Automatic recognition systems helped speed up the process of identifying and eliminating potential suspects. International cooperation with police databases has expanded the possibilities of searches beyond the country's borders. Criminal psychologists have compiled a detailed profile of the likely perpetrator based on the manner in which the crime was carried out and the behavior at the crime scene. This profile has helped investigators better understand the motives for the crime and the characteristics of the person or persons who might be responsible for the murders. The analysis of behavioral patterns provided important clues for the future direction of the investigation. Psychologists analyzed the manner in which the murders were committed, the organization of the crime, and any ritual or symbolic elements present at the crime scene. This information helped to determine whether it was a spontaneous act or a carefully planned event. The profile also indicated the offender's possible prior experience with violent crime. Studying similar past cases provided an additional perspective to understand the possible motives and modus operandi of the offender. The comparative analysis helped to identify common elements that could lead to the discovery of the identity or at least a narrowing of the suspect pool. Given the possibility that the perpetrators may have fled across borders or that the case may have had an international dimension, cooperation with police forces in other countries was initiated. The exchange of information through Interpol and other international organizations extended the scope of the investigation and allowed access to databases that were not available at national level. Specialized teams were sent to countries where the presence of perpetrators was suspected or where leads were found leading to possible associates or accomplices. This international dimension of the investigation has greatly complicated the work of detectives, but has also opened up new opportunities for obtaining key information. Coordination between different police forces required careful organization and constant communication. Language barriers and differences in legal systems presented additional challenges that had to be overcome to successfully complete the investigation. This complex and multi-layered investigation represented one of the most challenging cases the local police have ever encountered. The combination of traditional investigative methods with state-of-the-art technology and international cooperation created the foundation for the gradual uncovering of the truth about this tragic event. We now come to the final phase of this tragic case, the trial to punish those responsible for the inhumane acts committed against Suzanne Capper. The trial represented the culmination of a long investigation and was intended to bring justice for the victim and her family. The trial against the perpetrators of the Suzanne Capper case was launched with the most serious charges possible under British law. The main charge was murder, the most serious offence known to the British legal system. The prosecution had to prove not only that the accused caused Suzanne's death, but also that it was done with intent to kill or cause grievous bodily harm. The kidnapping charge was for illegally holding Suzanne against her will. The prosecution presented evidence of how Suzanne was lured under false pretenses and then held captive for 7 days. This charge was crucial because it established the legal framework for all subsequent acts of abuse as crimes committed in the course of another serious crime. The charge of torture constituted a separate category that reflected the systematic nature of the abuse to which Suzanne was subjected. British law distinguishes between ordinary battery and torture, which is characterized by the deliberate infliction of extreme pain and suffering over an extended period of time. The prosecution had to document each act of abuse in detail and prove that it was committed with the intent to cause maximum suffering. The charge of endangering life related to the conditions in which Suzanne was held: lack of food, water, medical care, and exposure to extreme temperatures. This charge was important because it showed that even without direct attacks, the conditions of confinement were themselves lethal. Jean Powell, who owned the house where the first phase of Suzanne's incarceration took place, was sentenced to life with a minimum term of 25 years. The court acknowledged that, although she was not the mastermind behind the most brutal attacks, her role as host and organizer was crucial in enabling the entire crime. During the trial, the prosecution presented evidence that Jean Powell actively participated in the planning and execution of the abuse. Her home became the center of criminal activity, and she provided the space and logistical support for all subsequent acts. The judge emphasized that without her cooperation, the crime could not have taken place on such a scale. Jean Powell's defense sought to minimize her role and present her as a person who was under the influence of the other perpetrators. She argued that she was afraid to refuse to cooperate and that her participation was rather passive. However, the court rejected these arguments based on the evidence of her active participation in decisions regarding Suzanne's fate. The sentence of 25 years represented one of the harshest sentences that could have been imposed at that time. In passing sentence, the judge emphasized the brutal nature of the crime and the need to send a clear message to society that such acts would not be tolerated. Bernadette McNeely was identified as one of the most active and brutal offenders. The court found her guilty of murder and all related charges. Her role has been characterized as that of the main driving force behind the escalation of violence and systematic abuse of Suzanne. During the trial, witnesses described McNeely as a person who displayed sadistic tendencies and clearly enjoyed inflicting pain. The prosecution presented evidence that she was the instigator of many of the most brutal attacks, and that she actively sought new ways to torture Suzanne. The defense sought to point out McNeely's complex personal background and possible mental health problems. It presented evidence of her difficult childhood and experience with domestic violence. However, the court acknowledged that while these factors may have influenced her behavior, they could not justify the brutal nature of her actions. McNeely showed minimal remorse during the trial and even appeared arrogant at times. Her courtroom demeanor was considered further evidence of her dangerousness to society. At sentencing, the judge noted that her attitude indicated a high risk of recidivism. Glenn Powell was convicted as one of the main perpetrators of the final attack on Suzanne. His role in dousing Suzanne with gasoline and setting her on fire was considered one of the most brutal acts in the entire case. The court found him guilty of murder with intent to kill. The prosecution presented evidence that Powell was one of those who drove Suzanne to the scene of the final attack and actively participated in setting her on fire. Witnesses described his behavior as cold-blooded and calculated. He showed no signs of hesitation or remorse during the commission of the crime. The defense tried to argue that Powell acted under the influence of drugs and alcohol, and that his judgment was impaired. It also argued that he was under pressure from the other perpetrators and that he was afraid to refuse to participate. However, the court rejected these arguments because the evidence showed that Powell acted knowingly and voluntarily. In sentencing, the judge emphasized that Powell's actions represented the height of brutality and that his role in the final attack was crucial to Suzanne's death. A minimum sentence of 25 years was deemed appropriate for the seriousness of his actions. Anthony Dudson was 16 years old at the time of the crime, which affected both the manner of his trial and the amount of his sentence. He was sentenced to indefinite detention with a minimum term of 18 years, which was appropriate to his age and legal status as a youthful offender. The court recognized that although Dudson was a juvenile, his participation in the crime was significant and active. The prosecution presented evidence of his participation in the final assault and his role in transporting Suzanne to the scene. His age was considered a mitigating factor but not a justification for his actions. The defense emphasized Dudson's young age and argued that he was influenced by older accomplices. It argued that as a juvenile he was more susceptible to peer pressure and that his decision-making ability was not fully developed. The court accepted these arguments in part, which was reflected in the lower minimum sentence. The indefinite detention system meant that Dudson could only be released after proving that he was no longer a danger to the community. This decision reflected both the need to punish a serious crime and the possibility of rehabilitating a juvenile offender. Jeffrey Lee was sentenced to 12 years in prison for false imprisonment. His role was considered less serious than that of the main perpetrators, but still significant in enabling the entire crime. The court acknowledged that although he did not participate directly in the most brutal attacks, his cooperation was essential to keeping Suzanne in captivity. Clifford Pook was given 15 years for false imprisonment and conspiracy to cause grievous bodily harm. His sentence was higher than Lee's because of his more active role in planning and carrying out some of the acts of abuse. Both men sought to minimize their roles during the trial and to distance themselves from the most serious charges. Their defense argued that they were passive participants rather than active perpetrators. However, the court acknowledged that their cooperation was voluntary and that they knew the nature of the acts that were taking place. We now look at how the whole Suzanne Capper case has affected British society and how the media has reacted to it. This section is important in understanding the wider context and impact of this tragedy on society as a whole. The media coverage of the Suzanne Capper case has been comprehensive and multifaceted, although paradoxically, it has not received the attention that such a brutal crime deserves. This was due to an unfortunate coincidence in timing with another shocking case, the murder of little James Bulger, which took place at the same time and dominated headlines across the UK. However, when the media did cover the case, it was often presented as a cautionary tale about the dangers of group dynamics and how seemingly ordinary conflict between young people can escalate to unimaginable proportions. Journalists stressed that this was not a crime committed by a single psychopathic perpetrator, but a systematic abuse carried out by a group of people who supported and encouraged each other in their brutal behavior. The tabloid press, particularly newspapers such as the Daily Mail and the Sun, used the case as an opportunity to discuss the moral decay of society. Articles often contained emotive headlines and detailed descriptions of brutality, which were intended to shock readers while selling more copies. These publications presented the case as a symbol of how far human cruelty can go when a group of people with no moral scruples come together. Serious media such as The Guardian and The Independent focused more on analyzing the social factors that may have contributed to the tragedy. These publications have sought to understand how such a brutal act could have occurred and have looked for answers in the socio-economic conditions in which the perpetrators lived. They stressed the need to address the roots of the problem, not just its consequences. The case of Suzanne Capper has triggered an intense debate on the protection of vulnerable young people. Many commentators pointed out that Suzanne was a typical example of an adolescent at risk. She came from a broken home, lacked stable adult relationships, and sought acceptance in the wrong places. Social workers and child welfare professionals used the case to highlight the gaps in the support system for at-risk young people. They stressed that Suzanne's story was not unique and that there were thousands of similar young people at similar risk. They called for better coordination between schools, social services, and the police in identifying and protecting children at risk. The debate also focused on the role of family and community in protecting young people. Critics pointed out that Suzanne's family failed to provide sufficient support and guidance, which made her more vulnerable to manipulation. At the same time, however, many warned against blaming the family too easily because it ignored the complex socioeconomic factors that affected their ability to provide care. A significant part of the debate was a discussion of how to recognize warning signs in young people at risk. Experts stressed the importance of noticing changes in behavior, school attendance, and social relationships. They called for better training for teachers, parents, and other adults in recognizing these signals. The brutal nature of the Suzanne Capper case led to a wider discussion about bullying and its extreme forms. Many experts have pointed out that what happened to Suzanne was an extreme form of bullying that escalated to torture and murder. This realization led to calls for better bullying prevention programs in schools and communities. Psychologists and psychiatrists used the case to highlight the importance of promoting mental health in young people. They stressed that many young people who are victims or perpetrators of extreme violence suffer from untreated mental health problems or childhood trauma. They called for better access to mental health services for young people, especially those from at-risk backgrounds. Discussion also focused on the phenomenon of group violence and how individuals can be drawn into brutal behavior by group dynamics. Experts explained how peer pressure and the desire for acceptance can lead otherwise normal people to commit horrific acts. This realization led to calls for programs that teach young people to resist negative peer pressure. Discussion of the role of drugs and alcohol in the case was also an important part of the debate. Many of the perpetrators were under the influence of addictive substances, which some experts believe may have contributed to their ability to commit such brutal acts. This led to calls for better drug prevention programs and addiction treatment as part of violent crime prevention. The case has also sparked a debate about how the media presents violent crime and the impact this can have on society. Some critics have argued that overly detailed descriptions of brutality can desensitize the public or even inspire copycats. Others, however, have argued that it is important to show the full extent of human cruelty in order for society to understand the gravity of the problem. The long-term impact of the case was increased awareness of the need for a comprehensive approach to preventing violence among young people. This approach included not only punitive measures, but also investment in education, social services, mental health programs, and community initiatives to support young people at risk. Overall, the Suzanne Capper case, despite relatively limited media coverage at the time it took place, has had a lasting impact on British society and contributed to important debates about the protection of young people, the prevention of violence, and society's responsibility for its most vulnerable members. We now come to the most important part of our narrative, the lessons we can take from this tragic event. It is important that we see the story of Suzanne Capper not only as a harrowing tale of human cruelty, but also as a warning and an opportunity to learn lessons that can help prevent similar tragedies in the future. One of the most important lessons from the Suzanne Capper case is the critical importance of open communication between young people and trusted adults. Suzanne found herself isolated not only physically, but also communicatively. She did not have a person in her life with whom she could talk openly about her problems, fears, and the dangerous situations she was getting into. This communicative isolation came about gradually. Suzanne moved away from school, which meant losing contact with teachers who could act as trusted figures. Her relationship with her stepfather was complicated, and she felt that he would misunderstand or criticize her for her choices. Her mother was virtually excluded from her life. This situation created a vacuum in which she had no one who could warn her of danger or help her when she got into trouble. It is crucial for young people to have at least one adult in their lives with whom they can talk without fear of judgment or punishment. This person can be a parent, teacher, school counselor, coach, or even a neighbor. It is important that this person is able to listen without judgment and provide practical help in difficult situations. Young people often do not recognize dangerous situations as quickly as adults. What may seem like acceptance or friendship to them may actually be manipulation or grooming. This is why open communication with adults who have more experience and can recognize warning signs is so important. Communication should be two-way. Adults should actively seek out opportunities to talk with the young people in their lives, asking questions about their friends, activities, and feeling states. At the same time, they should create an environment in which young people feel safe to come forward with problems or concerns. The case of Suzanne Capper shows us the devastating power of group dynamics and how group pressure can lead to extreme violence. The group of perpetrators did not form overnight. It was a community of people who gradually radicalized and supported each other in increasingly brutal behavior. Group pressure works in several ways. The first is the normalization of deviant behavior. When more people do something wrong, it seems less wrong to individuals. In Suzanne's case, the abuse began with small humiliations and verbal attacks, but gradually escalated to physical violence and eventually to torture. Each step seemed just a little worse than the previous one, so it seemed normal in the context of what had already been done. The second mechanism is the diffusion of responsibility. When multiple people are involved in an activity, each individual feels less personal responsibility for the outcome. The perpetrators could tell themselves that it was not their fault because everyone else was doing it, or that it was someone else's idea. A third factor is the fear of being excluded from the group. Some perpetrators may have wanted to stop or leave but feared being excluded from the group or becoming the next victim. This fear is particularly strong among people who have no other social ties or who depend on the group for their basic needs. It is important for young people to understand that real friends will never force them to do things that are wrong or dangerous. If a group requires someone to do something that goes against their values or makes them uncomfortable, that is not the group they should be in. One of the most important practical lessons from the Suzanne Capper case is knowing where to go for help in a crisis. Suzanne was not aware of the resources available to help or was afraid to use them. This ignorance cost her her life. Crisis centers are specialized facilities that provide immediate help to people in danger. These centers are usually available 24 hours a day and have trained staff who know how to handle different types of crisis situations. They can provide not only immediate shelter, but also long-term support and help to move to a safe place. Helplines are anonymous telephone services where people can talk about their problems without fear of their identity being revealed. These services are particularly useful for people who are afraid to seek face-to-face help or who are unsure whether their situation is serious enough to seek help. Helpline operators are trained in providing emotional support and practical advice. Social services have a statutory duty to protect vulnerable people, including young people at risk. Although the social services system has its shortcomings, it is still an important source of help and protection. Social workers can help with finding safe accommodation, legal protection, access to health care, and other practical needs. It is important that young people know that seeking help is not a sign of weakness or failure. It is a courageous act that can save a life. In addition, many services are designed to be as easy and least intimidating to use as possible. In addition to formal services, there are also informal sources of help. These include trusted adults such as teachers, coaches, religious leaders, or even parents of friends. Sometimes the first step to getting help can be as simple as talking to someone we trust. For those who witness someone being abused or threatened, it is also important to know how to help. Silence is not neutrality. It is often complicity. If someone sees or suspects that someone is being abused or threatened, they should report it to the appropriate authorities. Many services also have anonymous reporting lines, so people can help without fear of retribution. The case of Suzanne shows us what can happen when all these protection mechanisms fail, but it also shows us why these mechanisms are so important and why we must constantly work to improve and make them more accessible.